Hello and welcome to the West Asia Post, a weekly show which is your window to the world's most happening region. I am your host, Ghadi Francis, and before we dive into our stories, let's take a look at the headlines.
The British government has invited Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to London. According to a Financial Times report, the visit is expected to take place in October or November this year. On a visit to the UAE, France's Trade Minister Olivier Beche says trade ties between France and Gulf states like Qatar and the UAE are expanding year on year. Minister Beche hails the deepening partnership as good news. Finance Minister of Kuwait resigns just 3 months after his appointment. Manaf al-Hajeri's resignation comes against a backdrop of perpetual political turmoil in the oil-rich country.
Starting with our top story, thousands of Israeli protesters descended back to the streets, protesting the Netanyahu-led coalition government call for renewal of judicial overhaul. Now, this wave of protests was triggered after the Israeli parliament adopted a key clause of the judicial reforms package in first reading. These waves of protests reminded people of the wave of protests that were unprecedented that happened during last year. Let's take a look.
This is how the streets of Israel looked like this week. Highways blocked, streets were taken over, dozens were arrested. And this is how the place looked like earlier this year. The visuals are almost similar. So is the scale of the protests.
I want to save my country from a dictatorship. I think this government has no earnest meaning of reform of the judicial system.
And the anger among the people, because the very cause of the agitation remains the same: the overhaul of Israel's judicial system.
A small step to dictatorship. They're going to ruin, they try to ruin our judicial system by enforcing laws that will demolish our democracy.
The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu-led coalition government launched its judicial overhaul plan in January. The proposed changes includes curbs on the Supreme Court's powers. At the same time, it gave the government decisive powers over the judiciary. The reform plans triggered weeks of sustained massive protests. They also alarmed Israel's Western allies. By late March, Netanyahu had suspended the push for overhaul and allowed for talks with the opposition parties. But 3 months later, the talks fell through, and Netanyahu relaunched his push for judicial overhaul. Although some of the originally proposed clauses were dropped in the new package, one of the clauses dropped would have allowed the parliament to override a court ruling. The coalition government is moving ahead with other parts of the reforms. This week, Israel's parliament adopted a key clause of the package, triggering the latest wave of protests.
Here are the results of the vote. 64 in favor, 56 against. I approve that the draft basic law, the judiciary, is justified. It will be accepted and will be forwarded to Constitutional Committee Law and Justice.
The latest parliamentary vote aims to scrap the reasonableness clause. The amendment would limit the Supreme Court's ability to void decisions made by the government. The courts could no longer strike down decisions taken by government officials by deeming them unreasonable. Proponents say this would allow more effective governance, while still leaving the court with other standards of judicial review, like proportionality. But critics say that without constitutionally based checks and balances, this would open the door to corruption and abuses of power. Many in the ruling coalition see Israel's judiciary as left-leaning, elitist and too interventionist in the political sphere. They also accuse the judiciary of putting minority rights before national interests and assuming authority that should only be in the hands of elected officials.
Even after the amendment, court independence and civil rights in Israel will not be harmed in any way. The court will continue to oversee the legality of government action and appointments. The government and the ministers will not be able to act with ulterior motives, act with conflict of interest, or make unqualified appointments.
But many in Israel are not buying the government's arguments. They believe the reforms will put Israel's democracy in danger. Critics say Netanyahu and his hard-right government will curb judicial independence. With serious diplomatic and economic fallout, allies like the United States have also urged Netanyahu to seek broad agreement on judicial reforms and to keep the judiciary independent. US President Joe Biden says he hopes Netanyahu would continue to move towards moderation.
Moving on to Turkey, which seems to be taking westward turns lately. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has recently given his nod for Swedish NATO membership. Now, also, the president has recently hosted in Ankara his Ukrainian counterpart, and he also called, saying that Ukraine deserves a NATO membership. Now, what is the reason behind Turkey's change of heart? And what were the trade-offs that enabled the same? This is what we will explore in this report.
The Turkish president has been quite busy lately, hosting his Ukrainian counterpart, closing negotiations for Sweden's NATO membership, inking agreements on security and defense with US, and trying to balance all of it with talks of meeting Russian President Vladimir Putin. With all that has happened this week alone, Turkey's westward turn is now more apparent than ever before.
By sending the 7-point draft to our assembly, which is currently on a break for this period. When it reopens, we will do this very quickly. I believe this agreement will be given priority by our parliamentary speaker before others in parliamentary sessions.
In exchange for supporting Sweden's NATO bid, Sweden has pledged support for Turkey's customs agreement with the European Union. Sweden will also support visa-free travel throughout the EU for Turkish citizens. And all of this is over and above Stockholm's continued actions against groups which Turkey deems as terror organizations. Apart from it, Turkey also got concession from another NATO member, the US, hours after Ankara said it would allow Stockholm into the bloc. Washington said it will proceed with the transfer of F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. The likely trade-off for Ankara's green light. Ankara seeks to purchase US F-16s and modernize the ones it already owns. The US-Turkey defense deal comes as a compensation for its removal from a US-led international program developing and producing new F-35 fighter jets. Washington sacked Turkey from the popular scheme in 2019 after Ankara decided to purchase Russia's S-400 defense system. The development led to a bilateral crisis between the two allies and Washington's imposition of sanctions on Turkey in December 2020. This made Ankara's veto on Sweden's NATO bid a thorn in an already rocky relationship with the West for more than a year.
You know, we're in this historic summit meeting. We're resolving a lot of things, I hope. And we made all the more historic by the agreement you reached yesterday and the addition of Sweden and how you're going to proceed. I want to thank you for your diplomacy and your courage to take that on.
Apart from the trade-offs and concessions, Turkey has some major domestic compulsions for turning westwards and putting its relations with Moscow in doubt. Inflation is soaring in Turkey at a whopping 39%. The devastation caused by earthquakes in February exacerbated Turkey's problems. In times like these, resumption of talks for Turkey's EU accession is a good sign. Turkey launched its bid to join the EU in 2005, but some of Erdogan's internal politics led to an indefinite suspension of talks. Also, Turkey is not just forging new paths in Europe. Erdogan's NATO play comes ahead of his visit to the Gulf countries next week. The trip is also focused in part to drum up foreign funding to boost Turkey's strained economy.
And now to Persia. For the first time in over a decade, an Iranian president embarks on a journey to Africa. The three-nation visit started in Kenya. Zimbabwe and Uganda were the next stops for President Raisi. Now this comes just a month after his Latin America tour. The Iranian president is boosting ties with US-sanctioned nations. In the next report, we tell you what are the reasons behind Iran's tour and visits, and why did it suddenly decide to expand its social circle? We tell you.
Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi wrapped up his three-nation Africa visit this week. He received grand red carpet welcomes in all three nations that he visited. The visit to Kenya, Uganda and Zimbabwe has been touted as a new beginning in Iran's relations with the African continent. The visit marks the first by Iranian president in more than 11 years. With African nations, Iran seeks to diversify its trade relations in the face of crippling US sanctions. Iran's president began the rare visit from Kenya, where he called Africa a continent of opportunities. The countries signed 5 memorandums of understanding. The MOUs signed touched upon wide-ranging issues, from information, communication and technology, to fisheries, animal health and livestock production, and to promoting investment.
Kenya remains committed to advancing and enhancing further engagement with Iran and our shared commitment to pursue the greater prosperity of our people, of our countries, and of our regions.
Raisi's next stop was in Uganda. Here, the Iranian president sharply criticized Western nations' support for homosexuality. He termed it one of the dirtiest things which have been done in human history. Uganda recently passed the world's harshest anti-gay law. The legislation prescribes death penalty for aggravated homosexuality.
The Western countries try to identify homosexuality as an index of civilization, while this is one of the dirtiest issues and one of the dirtiest things which have been done during the history, and they are strongly attacking against the basis of families and culture of the nations.
At the final stop in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwean president greeted Raisi as his brother. Like Iran, Zimbabwe is also under US sanctions. Raisi is the highest profile leader to visit Zimbabwe. The visit comes in the thick of an election campaign for a closely watched August 23rd presidential and parliamentary vote. Zimbabwe and Iran signed 12 MOUs to strengthen bilateral ties. The MOUs include plans to create a tractor manufacturing plant in the country, along with agreements on energy, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and others. Africa has emerged as a diplomatic battleground lately. Countries like Russia, China, India, and the West are all trying to deepen relations, especially trade relations, with the continent. Iran stepped up diplomatic outreach to developing countries after the US withdrew from Tehran's nuclear accord in 2018 and reimposed sanctions. Iran recently started to mend relations in its neighborhood. China brokered peace accord with Saudi Arabia. It was the first step in this direction. The Iranian president also visited 3 Latin American countries to shore up support with allies also saddled with US sanctions. Raisi did the same in Africa as well, But it remains to be seen whether all of this will amount to anything substantive for the Iranian economy.
And now to Syria. To Russia in particular, Russia vetoed a UN agreement that would provide international aid to rebel-held areas in Syria. It was supposed to flow through Turkey without the approval of the Damascus government. Now, after the veto, what is really the situation on the ground? This story tells you more.
A key United Nations brokered agreement has lapsed, and thousands of Syrians are alarmed by the development. The deal allows for the delivery of aid over land from Turkey into the rebel-held areas of Syria, expired this Monday. The UN Security Council has failed to reach a consensus on extending the deal. Russia vetoed a 9-month extension and proposed a 6-month extension instead. None of the other countries, except for China, agreed on the same. This has thrown into doubt a vital mechanism that provides life-saving support to thousands of people. The accord provided for the international aid to flow into the rebel-held places of Syria via Turkey through the Bab al-Hawa crossing. The crossing provided for more than 80% of the needs of the people living in rebel-controlled areas. But the government in Damascus has repeatedly denounced the aid deliveries as a violation of its sovereignty. The aid mechanism comes up for renewal every 6 months due to pressure from Syria's ally, Russia.
This issue recurs every 6 or 9 months, and it is therefore necessary to set up a United Nations mechanism to help prevent the repetition of this cowardly act by Russia and its allies. It's impossible for anybody to cope, particularly if they have children. Even a childless person can't get by.
According to the UN, 4 million people in Syria depend on humanitarian assistance to survive following years of conflict, economic strife, and devastating earthquakes. After an earthquake in February, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad agreed to the opening of 2 additional crossings. These crossings will remain open despite the Security Council's failure to reauthorize the use of Bab al-Hawa. But the authorization for these 2 other corridors is also set to expire in mid-August. UN says these 2 crossings cannot match Bab al-Hawa, which handles 85% of aid.
Do you want to fight us for our food? A little help can mean a big thing. You're fighting us for our food. I have 3 daughters and 2 sons. We live from day to day and you're fighting us for our food? What's happening to you?
Russia's veto prompted strong reactions. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed disappointment at the development. The European Union deplored Russia's veto as further politicization of humanitarian assistance that puts lives at risk. And the Human Rights Watch called Russia's veto cynical.
Now to Cyprus. This island has always been known as the island of cats, but this year a big tragedy has hit these animals. Over 300,000 cats died of cat COVID since January this year. Now, although it doesn't affect humans, it is really fatal for these animals if it's not treated immediately. We tell you more.
In the island of cats, they are everywhere. Cyprus has treated its cats just the way they see their people, with honor and lots of love. But the prolific cat population on the island is now under threat. A strain of feline coronavirus is wreaking havoc. More than 300,000 cats have died since January this year from feline infectious peritonitis, or FIP.
The virus itself comes from a mutation from the feline coronavirus, the enteric form. So we know that there is a mutation somewhere, most probably on the S gene. Some people believe it. Some other people now are arguing with that theory.
FIP has rapidly spread across Cyprus in recent months. It is highly contagious among cats with a high mortality rate. Cats with FIP have symptoms including fever, abdominal swelling, weakness, and sometimes even aggressiveness.
And the virus completely changed the approach and the aggression. So it takes over all of the body after the mutation. So why the mutation is happening and why it's happening more often now, we don't know. Okay, it's very strange. So it's one of the cases.
Animal advocates say the number of cats dying from this disease is significantly higher than the 107 cases of FIP officially reported by the Agriculture Ministry in the southern part of the island.
What will happen if FIP continues to mutate in Cyprus is death. The numbers of cats will be severely diminished, and it's not just that they're dying in excruciating pain. And I know us Cypriots take pride in saying Cyprus is the island of cats. Unfortunately, very shortly, if we don't take immediate action, what we will be saying is Cyprus is the island of dead cats.
Hi, baby! Oh my God, I want to take him home.
Experts say the island's cat population is equal to or even exceeds the human population of a little more than 1 million. To contain the spread, 2 treatment options have been considered. One is molnupiravir, an anti-COVID pill which officials say could not be authorized for use on animals in Cyprus, so that's out of the window. And the other option is an antiviral tablet, chemically similar to the COVID-19 treatment remdesivir, but it costs somewhere between $3,300 to $7,700 per cat, so the second option is also not feasible. Hence, some pet owners are opting to get the cheaper medicines from the black market.
For there is no legal treatment, there is only one legal treatment, which is very expensive. People are finding treatment options via different routes, internet, black market, and that is what we worry about, because nobody knows what they are getting.
An outbreak is also suspected to be spreading across cat population in nearby Lebanon, Israel and Turkey. But in the absence of studies, these outbreaks cannot be confirmed.
That's all we have for you on this episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, always bringing you the most recent updates, news, stories and ground reports from one of the most volatile regions in the world. Until then, stay safe. I am Ghadi Francis, signing off from Lebanon. Keep on watching WION. World is One.